Welcome to another episode of the Building Your Career podcast. Today, I'm joined by Lizi, and I'm really excited to have her on as a guest. There's some really cool topics that I want to go through that I know our listeners are going to be really interested in. I suppose I'll start off where we always start off. Lizi, could you just kind of introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about your background in the company?
Yeah, sure. I'm Lizi Cushen. I'm an associate director at White Red Architects. I've been with the practice about 3 years now, and they've been established for 7. So I'm about halfway through their kind of existence. And it's founded by 3 directors, one of whom I'd collaborated with in a previous practice. And that's kind of how I'd engaged with the practice originally. And then we started kind of having discussions about what shape they were developing the business into and how I might then support that from my role. I previously worked at AHMM for 12 years, developing a variety of predominantly kind of commercial projects and a theatre on top of Crossrail, which kind of was a lot of complex technical interfaces, as you can imagine.
Mhm.
So my role within White Red is specifically focused on the operational and technical delivery, and that's where I focus the support of the team. We're about 17 architects now, and so we're quite a flat structure across projects, and my focus is on developing the tools and the language within which we can better communicate across those projects within the teams.
Awesome. What kind of projects are you get involved in?
Yeah.
What kind of projects are you working on?
We're predominantly doing retrofit and renovation of commercial schemes in London. We've got some
Okay.
outlier locations, but that's kind of 90% of our work. And we do that will kind of vary from speculative office design for developers to fit out and the use of the office with businesses like Virgin. We've just done their headquarters in Whitfield Street, and we're kind of supplementing that work with some engagement with hotel brands. We've done some look and feel that's been then rolled out across their offers across the world, and we've also looked at how we integrate that into our kind of more interior architecture work that we're developing. But fundamentally, it's commercial retrofit and renovation.
Okay, awesome. Just a quick question on that one as well, because it's retrofit and renovation. I suppose, how on board are developers when it comes to sustainability and when it comes to having that embedded in the construction process from an early stage?
Yeah, it really varies. We have some what I'd call quite green clients, people who don't brief frequently. And so they've got an asset that is part of a business plan, but they're not specifically developers. And so they will need far more support in understanding, firstly, what's appropriate for the building and what's going to be viable, what's going to better it. And it also depends very much on their plan for the asset, like whether they want to just flip it and sell it onwards, or whether they're investing in this in terms of a continuity of the building within their plan. We'll always try and communicate with our engineers about what a menu of options would be. And there's
Okay.
obviously always a dialogue with agents with commercial projects as well about how they're going to market it and how appealing that is. You know, with occupiers now, there are real expectations, rightly so, about how a building's going to operate and what we're doing in the renovation in order to facilitate that. So even where we're renovating and we're not engaging vastly with a planning permission submission, which obviously will have its own sustainability requirements, we will kind of facilitate a conversation very early on when we're developing the brief to make sure that the sustainability criteria are firstly acknowledged, because sometimes it's not even on the agenda, and secondly that we find a way of using the right language with the client team and the design team so that we're all aligned in actually what that facilitating that might be. Really what we find is that the baseline really is the consequential improvements with Part L, and even acknowledgement of that, because most of our projects now would be over 1,000 square meters. It's kind of still sometimes a bit of a journey to get that acceptance. I mean, BREEAM is far more prevalent and it's less of a conversation now. We're implementing lots of WELL, but still understanding on what neighbours is and how to facilitate it on projects is very loose and quite varied.
Yeah, I think it's all about awareness as well.
Mm.
It's all about making sure that people are aware what their options are, what their regulations are, how they can go, that how they can do a little bit extra, how they can get the clients on board from earlier on in the design process. So I do think it's about kind of getting the information out there and making people aware of it as well, of how significant their impact can be on projects as well.
Using the right terminology that's accessible, like often with
Yeah, that's true.
sustainability things, like the criteria or the kind of assessment metrics can be quite scientific. And if you're
Yeah.
not attuned to what that will fundamentally mean operationally for a building, then you're less capable of translating that into a kind of functional transitional concept in your head. So it's trying to support the mechanical and engineering consultants that we're collaborating with to be able to have those conversations in more of a fluent way, which is
Mhm.
quite an interesting process. And some people are more naturally capable of doing that transition. And some clients fundamentally need diagrams in order for that to compute and to be relevant to their business or how they process the kind of the quality or the assessment of where the value lies with those kind of criteria.
You've touched on a kind of quite a key topic here because it's kind of the communication between the engineers and the architects. I think anyway, because I've worked in architecture myself and I've worked in the
Yeah.
engineering industry for a long time now. But I suppose I just wanted to get from you, from an architect's perspective, how do you kind of define good communication between engineers and architects, and what does that kind of look like throughout the construction process?
Yeah, it's something we've been really investing a lot of energy in trying to refine within our practice. And we're
Mm.
iterating all the time. Like, we're never going to leave something and think, oh, that's kind of perfected or we've cracked that now, we'll just sit still. It's just not our instinct. But what we're really actively trying to do, so myself and Joe specifically, who's one of the directors, we deal with more of the live project iteration. And we're constantly kind of trying to develop a toolkit that can support the architect. So we have continuity across our projects in how we're approaching things. But we kind of split it into two areas. So we have these kind of conceptual designing with your heart. So that's the instinctive components of the building that we're talking about that are going to give you a narrative. They're going to give you a purpose within the design intent. And for us, that's fundamental for the whole team to understand and that we're all aligned with, because it gives you far more ability when you're thinking about the distribution of kind of the budget, about where to prioritize and focus. And then we have the design with the head, which are all the technical criteria and the obviously extensive kind of Building Safety Act considerations, lots of fire engagement, things like that, that if you try and kind of merge those too early in the process, they squash each other. So the
Mhm.
conceptual stuff can completely eradicate consideration of the technical appraisal.
Yeah.
And if you focus too much on the technical, it kills all of the heart and the kind of energy behind the project. So we always approach every design team meeting with both considerations. And we found that that's been a really constructive way of working with the team as well, because it provides very clear opportunity for everybody to collaborate on both sides of that development. And I think because we're continually referring back to both, so what's the core aim? What does success for this project look like? What's the narrative? What's the compelling kind of part of the design intent that's going to get everyone excited and that they'll remember? And sometimes it can feel a little bit like it's a trope or it's not necessarily innovative, but it's the thing that's relevant to that specific building. And there's always going to be parts of when you're looking at renovation, there's going to be threads of, contextual input, how it relates to the street or a historical use in the building that becomes more relevant again and that you can introduce back into the architectural language and therefore what we're providing within the fit out or the retrofit. And then there's the kind of, and it will kind of adjust as you go through the REBA stages. But if you have that understanding across the team and the clients, and that's consistent, it keeps everything propelling along. And it means you can kind of eddy the storm of VE and things and engagement with contractors and stuff. So, because those can, particularly at stage 3 and 4, when you're very focused on delivery of a set of information that's trying to communicate technically what the proposal is and how it's all coordinated, it can be quite easy to lose sight of the core purpose of the original concept.
Yeah.
So that's kind of something that's really interesting to us. And in terms of tools, that means that it can liberate a structural engineer to be able to think a bit more laterally about different ways of implementing a solution. If there's we've got a project on at the moment, it's actually quite a tight retrofit budget wise, but it's got this primary concept about an RCPS soft fit treatment and how all the services are integrated into it in order to elevate it's essentially a room per floor, this office. But it's got this very defined proposal about the seamless detailing of the ceiling. And that means everything underneath that veil can kind of be a bit quieter and more efficient, because as long as that's really tight and clean, it holds the space. And everyone kind of got that from the beginning. And that's been the priority in terms of where we're distributing the money. And it's meant that the focus was driven on the coordination of that area first, and then everything trickles down. Does that that's one example of how that works for us.
That makes complete sense. You put it really, really well there. I like the balance between the conceptual and the technical, and making sure that there's that underlying thread of the kind of concept behind the design being carried through, but communicating what the original intention was and making sure that there's a balanced approach to it. And as you say, not going too far one way or the other, really. I think you put that very, very well.
Yeah, tension's always going to create opportunity for kind of productivity and creativity across all of these professions. So when you can identify the kind of the core component that's probably the most problematic thing or the most challenging, actually assessing it in the context of everything else can sometimes feel very overwhelming. So sometimes isolating it, really cracking it, and then finding out how to then reintegrate it back into the project can feel a lot more collaborative in the end, because otherwise you end up with this kind of tussling of everyone saying, well, my discipline needs to consider this. It can get quite challenging in a complex project. So sometimes it's useful to just step back a little bit and be able to address it in that way.
Great. That's great. I really, really like that answer. I suppose, obviously I know of you because you were a guest speaker at the Women in Engineering event by Jensen Hunt. I was quite keen just to kind of gauge your thoughts on kind of where the industry is at now. I suppose what kind of needs to improve, or indeed the history. But I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts, or maybe, come at some of the topics that you were talking about at that event.
Yeah. It was really interesting, actually. It was kind of a stretch for me. It was the first time I'd done something like that. And it was amazing. The panel were a really vibrant, mixed group of people with different experiences. So that was really fascinating for me originally. I think what I was really excited about talking about and considering, what I actually found really useful was we met a number of times before the panel in order to kind of rough out the themes and identify really what we were passionate about between it. And through that process, it transpired that I became a lot clearer about really my own values as a female leader, and what is compelling me to want to continue to develop my skill set and to continue. I've always been ambitious, and I come from a family of people who are like, my husband's always saying, God, the cushions. So they're always like, they're just never satisfied. They always want to keep propelling forward, whereas his family they're professionals, but they're kind of they've got a pace and they just kind of go. Whereas there's always more tussle. And it's interesting because you never really acknowledge it, do you, until you're confronted with something else. But for me, that panel discussion was really about how do we liberate women in the profession to be their own type of leader, to not have to kind of align with patriarchal norms that don't fit, they don't sit well with you. How can you be kind of really genuine with who you are as a person, and therefore lead with any kind of conviction if you're not comfortable to do so in your own way? And I think that for me comes down to a lot of different things about communication style and also transparency. We spoke a lot in that session about really simple things like being honest in your time, in your calendar. Where are you? What are you doing? And that will, by example, explain to your team that it's completely reasonable that you've got some kind of complex school drop-off scenario, or someone's dropped the ball and you've had to go and pick it up. Like if we don't lead by example, we're never going to facilitate the flexibility that not even just women, people need in the workplace in order to manage everything else that sounds, it's not ancillary, it's just alongside your professional life. You have a lot of other complex, sometimes very complex needs and demands. So that was part of it. But I think the key thing for me was also about acknowledging that key to my way of approaching that is to implement joy in the way that we lead business, and that can really instigate a lot of creativity from a business perspective. So I've never been a founder, I've never led my own business, but I've always had a very passionate kind of interest in how to kind of develop, support and push the businesses that I've contributed to, that I've been working as an employee. I've always been an employee, but I've never had that. It's the opposite of entrepreneurship, isn't it? It's intrapreneurship. It's about how to propel and be ambitious for the business that you've committed to working within, how you can do that from within. I don't want to take the risk of setting out my own stall. I've got lots of complex demands outboard of work. So that's not something that I'm prepared to compromise on. I want to be an employee very clearly, but what I also want is to not compromise on what I think the values or the success can be. And I think that's kind of nice to then finally recognize that and kind of be grateful for it, but also kind of be quite proud of that fact. Like that's a very particular facet, because I can pan back. And I think that's the dynamic that with the 3 founding directors that we have at White Red, they set up without any financial funding. So it's always been the breadline for them. They've always had to make sure they've got the project. That's the priority. And so for me to come in with a slightly different lens, because I don't have that pressure, and I can therefore stand back and say, what will this project provide us? Is it the quality that we want? Are there any risk elements about, the team that we know we're going to be working with, or the profile of the client, or the specific project? Does it work for us? Have we got the capacity? So it's useful for them to have a sounding board that isn't so enmeshed in the lifeblood of having to make it work. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, and it's important to me.
Yeah, I know exactly kind of where you're coming from there. It's very similar to myself and my role here. I suppose for you, I suppose maybe the history, or what do you think are the fundamentals to be able to push the business forward from kind of what it was previously, and to be able to push it forward? What key things do you kind of focus on then?
We're very open and everything's on the table. And I think we've worked quite hard, and we collaborated with a business coach for a while. And that was fundamentally, it was just, how do you communicate and how do the others communicate, and how are they compatible? I'm like a proper extrovert. Like I get energy from people. I do need time to think and for silence to focus, but that's not really the personality trait of everybody that I work with within our studio. And we're literally in one big room. It was a yoga studio. And so we're all in one space. So that's great, because it's very passive and you can hear conversations developing. And I tap in a lot to the technical discussions going on around me. It's very collaborative in that way, which is good. In terms of the team with the directors and the dynamic that we have there, it's the acceptance that error happens, or we all make mistakes, and that we can iterate on a test, and and also the ability to try something, suck it and see. So that's something that I've always been very appreciative of since being there, is I've put recommendations forward and they're considered, but we'll implement them within like a month. Right. That's the benefit of being in small practice as well, though. Like I've seen it very much the other end of the scale, and it's very hard to implement quick change in a big organization. So I think that's personality type, but it's also a situation, it's a scale. issue, but that's very valuable that we can say, this is a beta test. We're going to try all this out. It might implode, but we can then reflect on it and learn. And that goes for operational decisions or financial structure changes, but also about just in terms of how we're doing the team briefings. That's evolved probably about 6 times since I started. Just how do we review in a studio? How do we appraise projects weekly? And those kind of tools. And they're fundamental to making it work properly in our team. So everyone's aligned.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, it kind of makes me think of where I had the light bulb moment where I kind of realized there was different personality types within the business. And just because I like being communicated to in a certain way, it doesn't mean anyone else. So I did a lot of research into personality types and how to switch up my communication style, really. So, yeah. I thought there was kind of some similarities there.
Yeah,
But,
I've got a friend who actually has a handbook of all her team. So when
okay.
they unroll, it's quite practical. It's like, are you a morning or an afternoon person? Like, if you get asked a question, do you like to be able to compose a response, or are you happy just working on the hop? And intuitively, you're going to get that team dynamic generally. But something that we're trying to continually do better is actually doing those kind of check-ins with clients as well. Client priorities from stage to stage will change. The way that they need to communicate both with us, but also up board or wherever they need to get sign off also changes. And I think we'd previously been leaning into inferring that through passive discussion or trying to interpret it, but we weren't also communicating that outboard to our project teams very successfully. So taking an active approach to having a check-in at stage points and being like, so what is our communication plan for the project now is very much like it's developing right now in terms of how we're trying to implement it. But I find it really interesting. And I think it gets received well, because if you feel like you're being heard, the thing is, most client bodies that we deal with as well, or project managers or DM, typically are also employees. So they have the same kind of pressures that we have, just in a different way. I mean, not always. We also work with owner clients and they'll have other demands or concerns.
That's brilliant. I suppose just kind of moving on to our final topic. I know you kind of touched on it before with when you mentioned Briam, but I was quite interested in, first of all, the connection with architecture and sustainability, and secondly, how you think that should be kind of communicated and what process that should be with the wider design team as well. So I suppose, what can architects do to embed sustainability into projects?
I think it's quite relevant because I've just spent the morning trying to clean out a well tracker, which has been painful, let's be honest. I mean, it's not always the most engaging of meetings. When we're doing a BREEAM assessment or a well assessment, the criteria, they're complex. They're quite dense in terms of getting that comprehension. And also it's difficult for teams to implement things when you don't have the whole hand of consultants available. I think that's the key thing, is being able to anticipate within your project who you're going to need to lean on in order to get the right kind of answers or to establish the right detail early enough. So for us, critically, it's about material information and trying to keep pace with knowing what's available and how to implement it and when to recommend. So we're not talking about the fundamental structural integrity of the buildings. We're talking about fit out here, or Cat A, or not implementing Cat A, which is still a huge battle that we have. Like, we see so much office floor plate being fitted out with a Cat A that then gets stripped out completely. And it's soul destroying. And that's not even to try and deal with an accreditation. This is just the fundamentals of how we deliver office floor plates. So we've done lots of interesting things where we've used fabric duct, and that's recycled in itself, but also because it's significantly less mass than the metal ducting. So then if you're you can reuse it, basically cut and shut it, a lot easier as well, so you could adapt it. So there's
Hmm.
bits like that, but really just having front end conversations. There's been some really good research within our profession over the last couple of years, some really nice reports developed. Hayward Tompkins have got a really good material resource, which we refer back to quite often. AHMM did a really useful report on Cat A, really, really interesting read. And just tapping into ACAN, trying to find those resources that are relevant so that that kind of iterative narrative and discussion, because everything's moving at such pace,
Hmm.
finding the thing that's most appropriate will quite often change. But really, it's the material passports and understanding the implication of everything and how it goes together as well, because that's the challenge now, with particularly with fire compliance. And we've had lots of things with kind of fire and acoustic performances of existing building, like hollow pot slabs, kind of
Hmm.
a continual challenge for us.
I think the material passport as well is such a crucial perspective to have, because I know I go to some of the engineers reuse or collective events where it's not just about the material itself. It's, how is the material formed? Where has it come from? What's the transportation? And I think it's the whole material life cycle that sometimes you need to be aware of, rather than just seeing it as the material on the building site. I think that's kind of quite a crucial aspect as well that a lot of people maybe don't take into account.
Yeah. A big consideration for us doing Cat A office is that we put a lot of tiles in, which
Mhm.
is, they're fired. They're really not that helpful. So trying to think about that in a bit more of a lateral way sometimes. But yeah, I don't have answers. I think we're just kind of still trying to learn and find the right resources to listen from, really.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully this podcast will be able to help.
Yeah,
But
yeah, exactly.
but Lizzie, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on as a guest on the podcast. It's been genuinely really, really insightful, and I've definitely found some kind of common ground there. So just goes to say thank you so much for being a guest on the Building Your Career podcast.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me.
Not a problem at all. Take care.